We often read the Gospels and imagine a peaceful, dusty land, where Jesus simply walked among gentle shepherds and fishermen, offering parables of peace and love. We picture a spiritual sanctuary, a place dedicated purely to worship. But this popular imagination is a dangerous lie, a softening of a reality so harsh and terrifying that it fundamentally changes how you understand every word Jesus spoke. The Jerusalem of the first century, the Jerusalem that Jesus entered on that borrowed donkey, was not a spiritual retreat. It was a political tinderbox, a pressure cooker of religious zealotry, staggering poverty, and the crushing, brutal weight of the Roman Empire's iron fist. This conflict between divine promise and earthly oppression, between the temple's holiness and Rome's unrelenting cruelty, is the forgotten mystery of the New Testament. How did the Messiah manage to preach a gospel of forgiveness and neighborly love when every cobblestone, every shadowed alley, and every marketplace transaction screamed of corruption, violence, and the desperate yearning for immediate bloody revolution? Why did God choose to plant the seed of the purest truth in the very epicenter of human oppression and relentless systemic evil, where the air itself was thick with injustice? Today we are not just reading a book, we are stepping over the sewage runnels and through the crowded, oppressive gates. We are going beyond the soft-focus Sunday school lessons. Get ready to discover the true, uncompromising, and terrifying reality of what it was really like to live in Jerusalem during Jesus' time, and in doing so, unlock a deeper appreciation for the cost of Christ's ministry. Picture the scene, the overwhelming sensory assault that hit any pilgrim or resident the moment they approached the massive city walls built by Herod the Great. The first thing that struck you was the noise, a cacophony of shouting merchants, bleating sheep, the metallic clang of Roman centurions marching, the rhythmic hammering of stonemasons, ceaselessly working on the still unfinished temple complex, decades into its construction. Then came the smell, a truly unforgettable and inescapable stench, a mixture of heady frankincense smoke pouring from the Temple Mount, mingling sickeningly with the smell of sewage dumped directly into the Kidron Valley, the thick, coppery scent of animal blood from the thousands upon thousands of sacrifices offered daily, and the pungent sweat of an unbelievably dense population squeezed behind those stone fortifications. Jerusalem was enormous, perhaps 60,000 permanent residents. But during the great pilgrimage festivals like Passover, that population could explode to well over 200,000 souls, all packed into tight, stone-cut streets. The heat was relentless, the dust fine and pervasive, coating everything in a yellowish-brown film. But beyond the physical discomfort, there was the omnipresent feeling of being watched, of being subject to an invisible yet incredibly heavy authority. High above the bustling markets, dominating the entire northwestern corner of the Temple Mount, stood the Fortress of Antonia, the colossal military barracks built by Herod and named after his patron Mark Antony. This was the headquarters of the occupying force, a structure so imposing that its shadow seemed to fall permanently over the Holy of Holies itself. From the parapets of Antonia, the Roman legions, their scarlet tunics stark against the white limestone, maintained a constant, unforgiving vigil. They weren't just observing, they were reminding every Jew that the God of Abraham might rule in the heavens. But Caesar ruled on earth, and Caesar's rule was backed by hardened steel and unforgiving discipline. Life was defined by this brutal duality, the spiritual requirement to be holy, pure, and obedient to the 613 commandments of the Torah, constantly undercut by the political necessity of surviving under a pagan, idolatrous regime. Every piece of coinage bore the image of the emperor, a blasphemous image, yet you needed that coin to buy bread. Every public gathering risked being misinterpreted as sedition. It was a life lived permanently on a knife edge. The tension was palpable. It was the engine that drove the entire economy and social structure of the city. we must understand the daily reality through the eyes of someone like Elias, a stonemason whose modest home was carved into the hillside outside the walls, overlooking the pool of Siloam. Elias was 40 years old, his hands perpetually cracked and calloused from shaping the hard Jerusalem stone, a task made necessary by the constant building projects of the Roman-backed elite. He wasn't a scholar or a Pharisee. He was Am ha'aretz, the common man of the land, struggling daily. For Elias, the first sound of dawn was not the shofar signaling prayer, but the sharp, echoing crack of the Roman foreman's whip driving laborers toward the construction sites near the upper city. His concern was elemental: water and taxes. Jerusalem was notoriously dry, relying entirely on sophisticated cisterns and aqueducts, many of which were themselves controlled and taxed by the Roman administration or the wealthy temple priesthood who colluded with them. Getting clean water for his wife, Naomi, to ensure ritual purity for cooking and washing was a daily fraught chore. Elias needed to earn enough by midday to pay the daily food tax levied by the Roman prefect's agents, and, more painfully, the annual half-shekel temple tax, which was required of every adult male Jew. This tax, though mandated by the Torah, had become a source of immense corruption. Elias resented the temple tax, perhaps even more than the Roman levies, because the Roman tax was foreign oppression, but the temple tax was oppression levied by his own brethren, the wealthy Sadducean priestly families who controlled the vast temple treasury. He knew that much of that money, meant for sacrifices and maintenance, disappeared into the hands of Caiaphas's family and their cronies, enriching them while the common people starved. This deep-seated resentment was the background noise of everyday life in Jerusalem. One day, as the sun climbed higher, Elias had to navigate the bustling complexity of the lower city to exchange his Roman silver for the appropriate Tyrian coinage required for the temple tax. His journey was a masterclass in risk management. Leaving his small, dark dwelling, he first checked the straps on his worn leather sandals, ensuring his feet were clean enough for the initial part of the journey. He passed women grinding grain, the harsh sound accompanying the morning prayers he mumbled under his breath. He navigated past the refuse piles, careful not to stumble, as physical injury could cause ritual defilement. He reached the narrow, winding streets that led up toward the great retaining walls of the Temple Mount. The air thickened with humidity and human density. He saw a group of zealots, men with dangerous eyes and bulky cloaks, whispering fiercely in a shadowed corner. They spoke of the coming revolt, the glorious day when God would use the sharp edge of the sword to cleanse Israel. Elias quickly averted his gaze. Association, even brief observation, could draw the attention of a Roman patrol or, worse, one of the temple spies, agents employed by the priesthood to report anyone showing rebellious tendencies. Reaching the vicinity of the temple courts, the commercial activity exploded into a dizzying rush. This was the place of the infamous money changers. Elias held tight to his purse of coins, knowing the dangers of being cheated were high. The standard Roman denarii or Herodian coins were not pure silver, and, critically, bore graven images of the emperor, making them ritually impure for temple offerings. He needed the old, pure Tyrian shekel, the currency of choice for the temple treasury, which the money changers cornered and exchanged at exorbitant rates. He approached a large wooden table crowded with shouting men who looked more like bandits than bankers. He had 50 days of hard labor represented in his small collection of coins, and he watched them carefully as the changer, a thick-necked man named Zadok, known for his dishonesty, clinked them, weighing their value. Zadok demanded an exchange fee that Elias knew was double the accepted rate, but arguing was futile. The temple guard stood close by, armed with staves, protecting Zadok and his business, which effectively made them partners in the exploitation. Elias clenched his jaw, handed over the required tribute, and receive the heavy, clean Tyrian coin, feeling a wave of spiritual and economic violation wash over him. This was the sacred temple, yet the moment one needed to interact with its official apparatus, one was subjected to greed and corruption. This was the very picture of the oppression that Jesus himself would confront with whips just days before his final arrest. With the proper coin in hand, Elias finally entered the great court of the Gentiles, an immense, bustling piazza surrounding the inner, restricted courts. It was filled with vendors selling sacrificial animals, doves for the poor, lambs and oxen for the wealthy. The stench here was overwhelming, a mixture of manure, blood, and the heavy perfume of rich men walking by, their robes flowing. Elias noticed the sheer scale of the temple structure itself. The massive white stones, the glittering gold plating on the gates. It was a staggering display of wealth and architectural genius, designed by Herod to awe not only the Jews, but the entire Roman world. Yet, as Elias walked, he had to constantly watch his steps, lest he tread on a puddle of blood or bump into a Gentile visitor, which would require ritual cleansing. His spirit felt crushed under the weight of simultaneous duties: reverence for God's dwelling, hatred for the Romans, disgust for the corrupt priesthood, and the constant fear of ritual impurity. He knew he was one of the many Am Haaretz, the unlearned people, whose constant struggle for survival made rigorous adherence to the thousands of purity laws almost impossible, making them perpetually suspect in the eyes of the stricter Pharisees. It was this very day that the intense political and social pressure that defined Jerusalem suddenly boiled over right in front of Elias. He was approaching the royal stoa, the magnificent columned structure along the southern edge of the Temple Mount, where teachers often debated. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the steps leading toward the Fortress Antonia. A small crowd had gathered around a man, a known zealot sympathizer who had been vocally protesting the inscription of a new Roman standard that contained an image of the emperor. The man was being dragged by a cohort of Roman soldiers, their faces grim and impassive beneath their bronze helmets. The prisoner was screaming, not in pain yet, but in defiance, shouting the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," a declaration that sounded like a war cry in that place. The Roman centurion in charge, a large, weary-looking man, simply gave a silent signal. Without warning, the soldiers threw the zealot to the ground and began to administer a public flogging, with whips tipped with small pieces of bone and metal. The sharp, wet crack of the lash echoed painfully off the temple walls, a sound that immediately silenced the marketplace. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dared not look directly, yet he could not move. The sheer brutality was designed not just to punish the individual, but to terrorize the entire population. Every man watching, Elias included, felt the sting of that whip on his own back. This was the daily reality of Roman peace, the Pax Romana, enforced through absolute public savagery. The theological weight of this moment was devastating. Here they stood in the shadow of the holiest place on earth, where the very presence of God was believed to reside, yet God seemed utterly silent, allowing this pagan oppression and violence to flourish unhindered. The suffering man's cries eventually dissolved into ragged gasps. The crowd, including Elias, dispersed quickly, eyes downcast, the terror overriding their pity. They knew the rules. Interfere, mourn too loudly, or even look too long, and you could be next. Survival meant invisibility. Elias rushed away, shaking. The image of the blood-stained paving stones burned into his mind. He walked until he reached the relative quiet of the upper city, where the wealthy lived in large, airy villas behind high walls. He hated these streets, too, because they represented the complicity of the Jewish elite. The Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, preached accommodation with Rome. They benefited from the oppressive status quo, ensuring the sacrifices continued and their power remained intact. even if it meant turning a blind eye to the daily humiliation of their own people. Elias felt the deep, agonizing fragmentation of Jewish society. You had the zealots, ready to fight and die. You had the Pharisees, focused entirely on the rigorous adherence to the law, often criticizing the common folk, like Elias, for their inability to maintain purity. You had the Sadducees, who were politically pragmatic collaborators. And then you had the masses, simply trying to survive, perpetually caught between theological mandates and military realities. As Elias hurried home, avoiding the usual routes, he overheard a conversation that pricked his fear and his desperate hope. Two women were whispering near a public well, drawing water. They weren't discussing taxes or Roman patrols. They were talking about a man from Galilee. "He speaks with authority," one woman murmured, clutching her jar close. "He challenged the scribes in the temple yesterday, they say." The other woman scoffed quietly. "Galilean? What good can come from Nazareth? They are unlearned peasants." The first woman lowered her voice further, almost to a hiss. "But they say he heals the crippled, and he speaks of the kingdom, not the earthly kingdom the zealots want, but a spiritual one, where the first are last." Elias stopped, momentarily forgetting the fear of the Romans. A kingdom not enforced by the sword, a purity not dependent on the money changers' rigged silver. This concept was utterly revolutionary and profoundly dangerous. To speak of any kingdom outside of Caesar's, even a spiritual one, was flirting with the same fate he had just witnessed by the Tower of Antonia. Yet the seed was planted. The suffering of living under the boot of oppression had made the ground fertile for radical hope. The approaching Passover amplified every tension in the city. Elias's wife, Naomi, was consumed by the necessary preparations. For a woman of Jerusalem, maintaining ritual purity was an exhausting, non-stop obligation. Before the feast, the entire house had to be meticulously scoured for any trace of chametz, leaven. They weren't just cleaning crumbs. They were performing a spiritual duty, ensuring the house was fit for the sacred observance. Naomi worked tirelessly, the dry air filled with the scent of vinegar and dust. She had to ensure every pot and vessel used year-round was properly purified or set aside, replacing them with special Passover earthenware. This intense preparation was expensive and draining, but it was the one area of life where the common Jew could exert total control over their spiritual adherence, a precious commodity when everything else, from their safety to their economy, was dictated by pagan occupiers. Naomi constantly worried about defilement. Had she accidentally touched something impure at the market? Had a foreign soldier's shadow fallen across their food? These anxieties were the constant companions of faithful life in the holy city. The sheer logistics of the Passover in Jerusalem were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims poured into the city. Every house, including Elias and Naomi's small dwelling, was obligated to host guests. The smell of roasting lamb filled the air, replacing the usual odors of the city. The noise level was deafening, a mix of celebration and apprehension. The Roman garrison at Antonia doubled, tripled in size. Pilate himself often came up from Caesarea to oversee the festival, knowing full well that such massive religious gatherings were the perfect breeding ground for insurrection. During the Seder meal, as Elias recounted the story of the Exodus, the release from Egyptian slavery, the words held a terrifying double meaning. They celebrated freedom from an ancient oppressor, even as the sound of Roman bootsteps echoed on the streets outside their door, reminding them they were slaves once more. The theological meaning of the Passover, that God intervened directly to save his people, clashed violently with the reality of their present subjugation. Elias began to seek out those who spoke of the Galilean rabbi, Jesus. He couldn't risk going to the temple courts anymore. The priests and their spies were too watchful, and the risk of confrontation was too high. Instead, he would slip away to the Mount of Olives just across the Kidron Valley. From this vantage point, you could see the entire panorama of Jerusalem, the gleaming gold of the temple, the formidable white walls, and the stern gray shadow of Antonia. It was here, in the olive groves, that Elias first heard the radical simplicity of Jesus' teaching. It wasn't about meticulous purity rituals or political revolution. It was about internal transformation. Jesus spoke of paying taxes to Caesar, frustrating both the zealots and the corrupt priests. He spoke of loving your enemies, a concept that sounded utterly insane to a people brutalized by Rome, and crucially, he spoke of God as Father, Abba, a term of shocking intimacy and direct access, bypassing the entire corrupt, costly temple bureaucracy that Elias resented so fiercely. This message resonated deeply with the Am Haaretz. They couldn't afford the complex sacrifices. They couldn't possibly maintain the rigorous purity demanded by the scribes. Jesus offered a way to connect with God that didn't require Zadok, the money changer, or Caiaphas, the high priest. It was a direct line based on faith and morality, not on silver shekels and strict ritual adherence. Elias realized that living under the brutal rule of Rome required a spiritual life that was mobile, adaptable, and internal, something the Romans could not tax, and the temple priests could not corrupt. This was the revolutionary power of the kingdom of God. It was established not by overthrowing Pilate, but by fundamentally changing the hearts of the people Pilate ruled. Yet this shift came with immense risk. When Jesus rode into the city just before Passover, hailed as the Son of David, Elias was among the crowd, waving a palm branch, shouting, "Hosanna!" It was an ecstatic, dangerous moment. The shouts of "King" directly challenged Roman authority, and every person present knew they were risking instant, violent suppression. This collective defiance was a release valve for decades of pent-up suffering, but the celebration quickly turned into dread. Elias watched as Jesus entered the temple courts and, armed with a makeshift whip of cords, violently overturned the tables of the money changers, scattering Zadok's impure silver across the sacred ground. The audacity was breathtaking. Jesus wasn't just protesting corruption. He was performing a prophetic action, declaring the entire financial structure of the temple, which was intertwined with Rome, spiritually bankrupt. The consequences of this action cascaded immediately. The Sadducees, the high priestly families, had their business disrupted and, worse, their authority publicly humiliated. They could not tolerate this threat. The Romans, though hesitant to wade into purely religious disputes, saw the ensuing chaos as a severe threat to public order and a prelude to rebellion. Elias understood instantly that Jesus had signed his own death warrant. Living in Jerusalem meant understanding the absolute finality of political power. The priestly elite and the Roman prefect might hate each other, but they would unite instantly to crush any third party, any Messiah, who threatened their joint control. When the arrest of Jesus occurred, it was executed with the chilling precision typical of the occupation. It was conducted at night, under the shadow of olive trees on the Mount of Olives, a calculated move to avoid the sympathetic crowds of the Am Haaretzoi. The temple guard, under the command of the high priest, worked seamlessly with a detachment of Roman soldiers. This collaboration was the darkest reality of life in Jerusalem, the Jewish authorities using the brutal tools of the pagan oppressor to eliminate a perceived spiritual threat. Elias heard the rumors and felt the wave of despair and fear sweep through the lower city. The man who had promised a new way was now silenced. The speed of the trial, the Jewish council convening illegally at night, the swift transfer to Pilate, the orchestrated crowd demanding execution, was terrifyingly efficient. It was a master class in swift, brutal suppression designed to send an unmistakable message. Hope is treason, and we control the power of life and death. The day of the crucifixion was the apex of the city's dread. Elias stood far back from the path leading to Golgotha, watching the procession of condemned men, his heart a lump of cold fear. The crucifixion was Rome's ultimate tool of terror. It was a spectacle designed not merely to kill, but to utterly dehumanize and publicly shame the victim, extinguishing any lingering spark of revolutionary hope in the witnesses. It was a declaration in wood and blood. This is what happens to those who challenge Caesar, or those who dare to claim a different kingship. For Elias, seeing the man who spoke of Abba hanging on that cross, suffering the most shameful, agonizing death Rome could devise, was the ultimate theological challenge. Where was the God who delivered Israel from Egypt? Where was the kingdom? The psychological impact of living through that event was profound. For many, including Elias, the immediate reaction was retreat. They went back to their lives, trying harder than ever to be invisible, fearing the inevitable Roman sweeps and reprisals that always followed public disorder. The hope Jesus had briefly ignited seemed to have been extinguished in the blackness that fell over the city during his final hours. But the reality of Jesus' resurrection, rumors of which began to circulate in the secretive, tightly knit communities, changed the game entirely. If Jesus truly had risen, then Rome had been defeated, not by a sword, but by God's power acting through suffering and death. This spiritual victory bypassed the entire architecture of Roman oppression and priestly corruption. It confirmed that the kingdom was indeed not of this world, not built on Herod's stones or enforced by Pilate's legions. Living in Jerusalem during Jesus' time meant constant theological negotiation under military threat. Every decision, what to buy, how to travel, whom to associate with, was filtered through layers of ritual purity, economic calculation, and political risk. The lesson for us, 3,000 years later, is profound. Jesus did not arrive in a vacuum. He arrived in a world saturated with tangible evil, where economic injustice was tied directly to religious practice, and political control was absolute. His message was revolutionary precisely because it offered freedom not from the Romans physically, but freedom within the Roman system, a spiritual liberation that no legionary could arrest and no tax collector could touch. The resilience of faith born in that oppressive environment is astonishing. The followers of Jesus, those who built the first church, were not naive idealists. They were survivors who knew the smell of death and the price of hope. They understood that the true battle was not fought with shields and spears, but within the human heart against the temptations of despair, corruption, and the easy road of collaboration. The depth of Christ's sacrifice is fully appreciated only when we understand the sheer intensity of the world he willingly entered. He didn't just preach in a troubled land. He stepped into a geopolitical powder keg, knowing that his uncompromising truth would ignite the wrath of both the empire and the temple establishment. He challenged the money changers because they represented the institutionalization of greed within holiness. He challenged the Romans by offering a higher allegiance. His bravery was not simply moral, but logistical and political. He faced the reality that for the common person, life was a daily struggle against defilement, hunger, and execution, and he offered them a redemption that transcended all of those earthly constraints. To truly grasp the Gospels, you must remember Elias, the stonemason, sweating under the relentless sun, calculating the high cost of the Tyrian shekel, flinching at the sound of the whip, and only daring to whisper the name of the king whose kingdom was not visible on the maps of the Romani. This reality is crucial because it reminds us that faith is not a comfortable accessory. It is a profound act of defiance against the principalities and powers of this world, whether they wear Roman armor or take the form of modern systemic injustice. Jesus' ministry was a movement born in the dust, the blood, and the terrifying shadows of Herod's magnificent yet utterly corrupt Jerusalem. His message was and remains the ultimate truth for those who live under the weight of oppression and despair. The life of a common person was fraught, short, and constantly under surveillance. The concept of freedom was almost unimaginable, Yet, within that brutal reality, the most radical, world-changing message of hope was born. We owe it to the historical truth to acknowledge the overwhelming cost of simply daring to believe in Jesus in that place and time. They lived lives defined by fear, but chose lives defined by faith. That choice is the legacy of first-century Jerusalem. Do not let this untold story fade into history. Embrace the grit, the suffering, and the revolutionary hope that defined life during the time of Christ.